Okinawa, June of 1945. A humid wind crawled through the canvas flaps of an American interrogation tent. Inside, a young Japanese nurse sat rigid on a wooden stool, uniform torn, hands clenched tight in her lap. Across the table, Sergeant Thomas Walker adjusted his collar, eyes fixed on her like he was trying to see straight through the silence. "Look at me," he said quietly, "and don't lie." For a moment, the only sound was the low drone of distant engines and the hiss of a lantern. This wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was something colder. Outside, the war still thundered artillery, shouts, surrender. But inside this tent, two humans stared across an invisible line drawn by history. Less than 1% of all prisoners taken on Okinawa were women. No manual had told the Americans what to do when they captured one. Most Japanese soldiers had been told death was honor, surrender meant shame. So when this woman was found alive, clutching a medical satchel near a destroyed field station, it confused everyone, especially the man ordered to question her. Walker leaned forward, elbows on knees, voice steady but carrying weight. "We don't hurt prisoners," he said. "But you need to talk." She said nothing. The tent flaps snapped in the wind like the ticking of a clock. He studied her face, no hatred, no fear. Just exhaustion carved into young skin. She finally met his gaze. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. The war outside disappeared. It was just two eyes locking in the middle of chaos. A soldier trying to do his job. A woman trying not to break. Somewhere between that silence and that stare, history began to tilt. The words that followed, simple, human, unexpected, would become the whisper that still echoes in declassified files. If you're watching this right now, pause for a second. Tell me, what city are you in, and what time are you watching this? Drop it in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Because this was the moment that started everything. The next morning, mist hung low over the Okinawan hills. Trucks rumbled down the dirt path toward a hastily built detention camp, barbed wire strung between bamboo posts, canvas tents lined like rows of ghosts. Inside one of them, she sat again, wrists loosely tied, staring at her own shadow on the wall. Nobody had told her what would happen next, because nobody really knew. In 1945, the U.S. Army had detailed procedures for captured male combatants, but nothing, absolutely nothing about women. Out of over 4,000 prisoners taken during the Okinawa campaign, fewer than 40 were female, mostly nurses or clerks. The manuals didn't even have the word she. When the MP brought her in, the lieutenant had frowned, muttered, "Protocol doesn't cover this," and passed her file to Walker's desk. She wasn't supposed to exist in their paperwork. She was a question mark with a heartbeat. Walker stood outside the tent now, cigarette trembling between his fingers. His training had taught him to break silence, not handle shame. He'd seen soldiers crawl out of caves, faces burned, screaming banzai. He'd never seen one lower her head, whispering only her name, Nakamura. Inside, Nakamura's mind spun like a compass gone mad. Back home, surrender was unthinkable. She'd been taught that Americans were monsters, that capture meant dishonor worse than death. But here she was alive, breathing, given water, even a blanket. That alone felt like betrayal. One guard whispered outside, "She's the only one." Another replied, "We should send her to the med unit, not interrogation." Nobody agreed. Nobody wanted responsibility. The confusion hung heavier than the heat. Walker finally stepped in, notebook under his arm. His tone was steady but softer now. "You're not a prisoner for long," he said. "We just need to understand what happened." She didn't answer. Her eyes stayed on the floor, tracing the shadows. He noticed her fingers twitch like she wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't cross that invisible wall between languages and loyalties. Outside, the sound of distant artillery still rolled across the hills. The war wasn't over, not even close. But inside that tent, something else had started a strange, quiet stand, off between duty and mercy. And when Walker closed his notebook, he realized this wasn't just another interrogation. This was about to become personal. Sergeant Thomas Walker wasn't born for war. Before Okinawa, he'd been a history teacher in a small town in Kansas, a place where people still left their doors unlocked, and every neighbor knew your dog's name. By 1943, he'd enlisted, trained fast, and ended up in the Army Intelligence Corps. They'd taught him how to detect lies, how to read silence, how to keep emotion out of it. But nobody trained him for this, an enemy who looked him in the eye like she was already somewhere between guilt and grace. When he entered the tent that afternoon, Nakamura was still there. The heat was thicker now, turning every breath into effort. He placed his canteen on the table and slid it toward her. She didn't touch it, he didn't push. Small moments like that, hesitation, refusal, were data points to men like him. He'd been told that eye contact could reveal truth better than words, but this was different. This was something he couldn't measure. "Do you understand English?" he asked. She hesitated, then gave a faint nod. "Good." He said, "Then you understand what we're trying to prevent, more men dying, that's all." Her silence felt like a verdict. He could almost hear his instructor's voice from Fort Benning echoing in his head. 22 minutes. That's the average time to get intel. After that, emotion clouds judgment. But minutes turned into hours, and the emotion wouldn't leave. Walker leaned forward, his accent soft but words clipped sharp. "Tell me where your unit's field hospital was based." No reply. How many wounded were moved south? Still nothing. He scribbled notes anyway, partly for show, partly to control his hands from shaking. Her eyes never left the dirt floor. She wasn't resisting. She was retreating into something far deeper. He realized this wasn't about secrets. It was about belief. Her world had told her that Americans were beasts, and here sat a man trying not to become one. Walker exhaled, rubbed his face, and muttered to himself, "She's not talking because she can't." Then louder, "Miss Nakamura, I'm not here to hurt you." For the first time, she looked up. That tiny motion, eyes lifting through the haze, was the first crack in the wall between them. And when their gazes met again, the silence started to hum. The tent was quiet enough to hear the lantern hiss. Outside, the Pacific wind dragged dust through the seams, fluttering the papers on Walker's table. Hours had passed since their last exchange. No screams, no slaps, no chains, just silence, thick enough to make a man question his own voice. Nakamura sat perfectly still, eyes fixed somewhere beyond him. Her face gave nothing away, not fear, not defiance. Just a strange kind of calm, like she'd already decided what she would and wouldn't lose. For her, silence wasn't weakness. It was control. The Imperial Army had drilled it in. Capture is shame, speak nothing, die with honor. Walker had read about that. Reports from Saipan said nearly 70% of captured Japanese refused to say a word, even under food deprivation. But reading it and sitting across from it were two very different battles. He was trained to break code, not people. He tried again. "You're a nurse. That means you help people, right? You saw the wounded, where were they moved?" No answer. Only the sound of fabric rustling when she adjusted her posture, hands tightening around her knees. Every passing second felt like static in his ears. He began pacing the tent. "Do you think silence saves anyone?" he muttered. "You think your officers care you're here?" He stopped himself mid-sentence. He wasn't angry at her. He was angry at the absurdity of this war that put a teacher from Kansas in front of a woman who refused to exist in his language. Through the flap of the tent, a corporal peeked in. "Any progress, sir?" Walker shook his head. "She's not cracking." The corporal hesitated. "Command wants results. They said use pressure if needed." Walker stared at him. "Pressure?" He spat the word like poison. "Get out!" The young soldier nodded, retreating fast. The flap closed again. Walker turned back to Nakamura. "Listen," he said quietly, almost pleading now. "I just need the truth." For the first time, she lifted her eyes, not in surrender, but in challenge. He froze. The air between them shifted. He stepped closer, voice low, but cutting through the tension. "Then look at me," he said. "Look at me and don't lie." That single line cracked the silence wide open, and neither of them could take it back. For a second, the world stopped breathing. Walker's voice had cut through the humid air like a rifle shot. "Look at me and don't lie." The words weren't loud, but they carried a strange weight, something deeper than command. Nakamura's head lifted slowly, her eyes catching the lantern light. What he saw in them wasn't defiance. It was exhaustion and something dangerously close to truth. He had interrogated men who spat in his face, who screamed until they broke. But this was different. This silence wasn't fear. It was will, and yet under that calm he saw it, the flicker of something human, fragile, terrified. He didn't blink, neither did she. Minutes stretched. The sound of the lantern flame wobbling filled the space between them. Outside, a jeep coughed to life, then faded into the night. Walker's heartbeat felt like artillery in his ears. She whispered something, so soft he almost missed it. He leaned closer. "Say that again," he said, "north of Naha." She murmured, barely audible. Her voice cracked on the last syllable. It was the first word she had spoken in 2 days. A single phrase, but it was enough to map a direction, a clue, maybe even a pattern of retreating forces. He didn't cheer, he didn't write. He just stared, caught between duty and disbelief. Her lips trembled. "I didn't want them to die," she whispered, as if confessing to herself. Walker nodded slowly. "You did what you could," he said. He wanted to sound professional, but the words came out raw. This wasn't victory. It felt like trespassing on something sacred. Psych reports later would call this moment reciprocal vulnerability, a split second where interrogator and prisoner forget the war around them. In studies done after the war, they'd claim contact under emotional duress could increase truth yield by 24%. But statistics never capture the ache of that silence, the trembling hands, or the way both of them realized something irreversible had just happened. Walker took a slow step back, exhaling hard. He couldn't tell whether he just succeeded or failed. Nakamura lowered her gaze again, eyes wet but steady. The war outside raged on, but inside that tent a strange peace had fallen. A fragile, guilty kind of peace that neither of them would ever fully explain. And in that quiet, both began to shake. The next day, the interrogation tent smelled of damp earth and kerosene. Walker hadn't slept. His notebook lay open in front of him, half-filled lines smudged with sweat. Across the table, Nakamura sat the same way she had before, but something in her posture had changed. Her eyes no longer hid behind silence. She was watching him now, measuring him. When she spoke, it wasn't about troop positions or maps. It was something smaller, almost accidental. "You have family?" she asked in halting English. Walker blinked. The question hit harder than it should have. "Yeah," he said after a pause. "Sister back home, Kansas." She nodded once, as if testing the sound of the word. Kansas. Her accent bent it into something soft and strange. Then slip. She mentioned a name, a field surgeon's name that connected to a battalion Walker's team had been tracking for weeks. He froze, pen hovering midair. She realized it too late, eyes widening as if she'd just seen her secret tumble into the dirt. He didn't gloat, didn't even move. He just looked up and said quietly, "Thank you. That broke something." She turned away, gripping the edge of her seat until her knuckles went white. "I didn't mean—" "I know," he said. "You didn't? According to declassified reports, even one unintentional detail an officer's name, a supply number, could expose an entire unit's location within minutes. In another tent, another interrogator would have called that a win, but Walker just sat there, hands shaking slightly. He wasn't sure whether he'd gained intelligence or just lost part of his soul. She looked back at him, eyes wet but unblinking. "Why are you kind?" she whispered. He didn't answer. The truth was, he didn't know anymore. Maybe because he'd seen too much cruelty. Maybe because she reminded him that war didn't erase faces. It only hid them behind orders. The corporal outside coughed, breaking the moment. Duty returned like a cold wind. Walker closed the notebook and stood. "That's enough for today." She nodded slowly, lips trembling between relief and regret. But as he reached for the tent flap, his hand stopped midair. It was shaking not from fear, but from something heavier, something he couldn't name yet. That night, the camp was wrapped in fog so thick it swallowed sound. The generator sputtered outside, throwing off uneven light that flickered against the tent walls like ghosts. Walker stood alone at his desk, flipping through Nakamura's file again. Pages of data, checkboxes, empty spaces where her name should have been. He closed it, exhaling through his teeth. None of it felt like truth. It felt like paperwork pretending to understand people. He rubbed his eyes and looked toward her tent. 2 guards stood a few paces away, whispering about poker and rations. "She won't run," one said. "She doesn't even look alive." The other laughed quietly. Walker didn't. He was already moving before he knew why. When he stepped inside, she was awake, sitting cross-legged on her cot, staring at the ground. She didn't flinch when he entered. The lantern cast soft shadows across her face, no makeup, no uniform left, just the weary look of someone who had seen too much war. He hesitated. "You should be asleep," he said. "I dream." She replied softly, "Bad." Walker nodded. "Everyone does here." He sat down on the opposite cot, keeping distance. Silence stretched, but this time it wasn't hostile. It was tired. "Familiar, do you hate me?" she asked suddenly. He shook his head. "No. I don't even know you." Her eyes lifted. "Then why help me?" Walker stared at the floor. The official answer, to gain cooperation, died in his throat. What came out instead was the truth he wasn't supposed to feel. "Because it's too easy to stop seeing people as people out here," he said. "I don't want to forget." For a long time neither spoke. The war outside felt distant, unreal. 2 people from opposite sides, trapped in the same kind of loneliness. A report later from the Army War College in 1945 had warned of this exact thing: emotional entanglement risk, contact with female POW to be minimized. But no manual could stop what had already started. Nakamura's gaze softened. "Your eyes," she said quietly, "not soldier eyes." Walker tried to laugh, but it came out broken. "Guess I missed that lesson in training." Then silence again. Only this time it wasn't just silence. It was gravity, pulling both towards something neither dared name. It happened so fast that neither of them could later explain how. The lantern flickered once, shadows dancing across the canvas walls. Walker had turned to leave, his hand brushing the flap of the tent, then stopped. Nakamura was still sitting there, staring at him, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched until it snapped. He turned back 1/2 step too close, and the distance between them disappeared. For a moment there was no war. No ranks, no uniforms, no orders. Just two exhausted humans whose worlds had collided and bled into each other. The kiss wasn't passionate. It was hesitant, trembling, confused, but it was real. It tasted of salt, smoke, and guilt. When he pulled away, his breath caught in his throat. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice cracking. She didn't move. Her hands trembled against her knees. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Because I shouldn't have," he said. The air felt heavier, as if the tent itself was holding its breath. Somewhere outside, a sentry's boots crunched on gravel. A dog barked once, then silence again. Walker took a step back, shaking his head, trying to rewind a moment that couldn't be undone. Reports from post-war tribunals would later note less than 0.5% of cases involving morale misconduct between captors and prisoners. Almost all were buried quietly, never written, never confessed. This was one of those moments. No record, no witnesses, only memory branded deep into two people who were never supposed to meet. Nakamura finally whispered, "I am enemy." Walker looked at her, eyes hollow. "Not right now," he said. "Not to me," that broke her. Tears slipped down her face, silent and fast. She didn't reach for him, didn't speak again. Just looked at the floor, ashamed of something neither of them fully understood. Walker stood frozen, torn between training and instinct. His heart hammered against his ribs like a warning. He wanted to explain, to fix it, to erase it. But war doesn't pause for apologies. Outside, the night shifted again, voices calling, boots moving, duty crashing back into focus. He turned away, leaving the tent in one jagged motion, the flap slapping shut behind him. What neither of them knew was that the real storm would start when someone else found out. The morning after felt heavier than any shellfire. Walker woke before dawn, uniform half buttoned, guilt sticking to his skin like humidity. The air outside the tent smelled of mud, coffee, and diesel, ordinary scents, made strange by what had happened the night before. Every sound seemed sharper: the clatter of mess tins, the cough of a jeep engine, the low murmur of soldiers unaware that one of their own had crossed an invisible line. Inside her tent, Nakamura sat still, her eyes dry but unfocused. She replayed the moment again and again, the hesitation, the nearness, the sudden heat of it, and couldn't decide whether she felt shame or sorrow. Maybe both. The war had stolen every kind of choice, and now it had stolen this too. Walker walked toward the command post with his head down, clutching his notebook as if paper could protect him. The sergeant at the gate nodded, but his look lingered too long. Had someone seen? Did the guards talk? Walker's pulse climbed with every step. Military tribunals after 1940. 6 recorded 12 documented breaches of conduct between American personnel and prisoners. Most ended with quiet transfers or ruined careers. No one wanted those stories told. They were stains on the uniform that no detergent could wash out. By noon, a corporal came knocking. "Sir, Captain wants a word." Walker followed, heart hammering. The captain looked up from his typewriter. "Interrogation subject, Japanese female, what's her status?" Walker hesitated. "Cooperative, sir." "Cooperative how?" The captain pressed. Spoke briefly, provided small intel, nothing major. The captain nodded, satisfied. "Keep it professional, Walker. We're not running a charity out here." "Understood, sir." Walker said, voice steady but hollow. When he stepped back outside, the light felt too bright, the noise too loud. He could still feel her presence, her voice echoing in his mind. He told himself it was done, that it meant nothing. But the lie didn't hold. In the women's quarters, Nakamura sat facing the wall. "I should have screamed," she whispered to herself. "But I didn't." Later that night, footsteps echoed near her tent. Orders had come down. she was being transferred north, away from the interrogation zone. Walker didn't know yet, but the distance between them was about to become permanent. By dawn, the paperwork had already begun its quiet erasure. A clerk in the operations tent typed the new report, the keys clacking in rhythm with the distant rumble of supply trucks. Verbal cooperation obtained. That was all it said. No mention of emotion, of mistakes, of moments that could ruin careers. Just clean language, bureaucracy's way of bleaching memory. Walker stood at the edge of the tent, watching carbon copies slide into folders marked confidential. Every interrogation was supposed to generate at least 3 forms: summary, transcript, and result. But nearly 80% of field notes like his were destroyed within 2 days, officially for security reasons. He knew what that really meant. Some truths weren't meant to travel home. He walked outside into the sunlight that felt harsher than usual. The war still thundered miles away, yet all he could hear was the sound of that typewriter hammering out amnesia. Somewhere behind him, Nakamura's tent was already empty. 2 MP had escorted her before dawn, a silent trance for orders stamped and sealed. Northbound, he wanted to ask where she'd gone, but he didn't. Questions like that drew attention, and attention in a war like this was dangerous. That night, Walker sat by the generator shed, flipping through the last sheet that still had her name. He stared at the words until they blurred, then folded the page and slid it into his breast pocket. Not as evidence, as proof to himself that it had been real. The next morning, his commanding officer called him in. "We're closing the file," the man said. "Mission complete." Walker nodded, understood. "Good, burn your notes." Walker hesitated. "Already did, sir." He hadn't. The pages were hidden inside his rucksack, between maps and ration slips. Maybe one day he'd throw them into the sea. Not today. In the official ledger, she became another nameless POW, female, approximate age 20, 3, medical staff. In the unofficial ledger, the one written on his conscience, she remained Nakamura, the woman who made him remember that war wasn't fought only with bullets. As the last light bled over the camp, smoke rose from the burn pit where old files turned to ash. Walker watched until the pages became sparks drifting into the dark. Nakamura's world turned to fences and schedules. The new POW camp was built north of Okinawa, where sea wind met red dust. Rows of tar paper barracks stood like exhausted soldiers, each tagged with stenciled numbers. Inside, the smell of boiled rice mixed with disinfectant and salt air. The guards here were different, tired, polite, more curious than cruel. Every morning began the same. A whistle at dawn, ration line at 6, medical check at 8. The Geneva Convention rules, which she had once been told the Americans ignored, now governed her life with unnerving precision. 3 meals a day, about 2,800 calories, someone said. Clean water twice daily. Soap issued weekly. Compared to the chaos she'd come from, it felt like a strange kind of peace. But peace with wire around it still felt wrong. One afternoon, Nakamura was assigned to assist American nurses tending Japanese wounded. She entered the infirmary and froze. White sheets, metal trays, English labels on medicine bottles, and in the corner, a young U.S. medic offering water to a Japanese soldier with bandaged eyes. The scene shattered something inside her. For the first time, she saw compassion from the people she'd been told were monsters. She moved slowly, helping where she could, changing dressings, holding trembling hands. No one shouted. No one struck her. A nurse even smiled once and said, "Good job." The words made her chest tighten in confusion. Reports from that period later noted that American-run POW camps maintained mortality rates 3 times lower than Imperial Army field hospitals. Food, hygiene, and even mail were permitted. It was survival, yes, but also a mirror. Every kindness reminded her how deeply her own side had lied. At night, she lay awake listening to the sea wind rattle the fences. Sometimes she saw Walker's face in her dreams, the look in his eyes before he turned away. She would wake suddenly, heart racing, not sure if it was longing or guilt. Days bled into weeks, then months. The war outside kept shrinking, rumor by rumor. Surrender was coming, though no one dared say it aloud. And yet each sunrise felt heavier, as if the end of war didn't promise freedom, only more questions about what it all had meant. By autumn, the camp had grown quieter. The guards smoked more, talked less, and waited for the war to end like men waiting for rain in a drought. Nakamura spent her days sorting medical supplies and writing names of the wounded in neat, careful letters, both in Japanese and the awkward English. She was learning one phrase at a time. But even in that silence, rumors moved faster than trucks. They started small. A nurse overheard a guard mention a sergeant from the South, who'd been reassigned after an incident. Another whispered he kissed a prisoner. The words traveled through the barracks like smoke under a door, thin, invisible, choking. Nakamura heard them one night while washing her tin cup. She froze mid-motion, the metal cold in her hands. No names were spoken, but she didn't need one. Her stomach twisted. Shame and memory battled inside her. She remembered his trembling hands, his voice breaking on the word sorry. She remembered not pulling away. Was it weakness? Or something else, something too human to fit inside the walls of war? She sat on her bunk that night, clutching a scrap of paper she'd hidden since her capture, a fragment of a Red Cross form. On its back she began to write in pencil, her English uneven. I do not hate him. I think he was lost same as me, but she didn't finish. She folded it up and tucked it into her pocket, where it would stay for decades. Official post or records would later show that 1 in 5 interrogators were quietly investigated for overfamiliarity. Most were cleared. A few were dismissed. None were named publicly. The system protected itself better than the people it judged. Still, rumors had their own power. Some Japanese prisoners began treating Nakamura differently, some with pity, others with disgust. One woman hissed, "You forgot who you are." Nakamura said nothing. Maybe she had. Maybe that was the only way to survive. By December, the guards' radios crackled with headlines: bombs dropped, surrenders signed, fleets disbanded. The war was finally ending, but for her, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like someone had pressed pause on a life that would never resume where it stopped. Years passed like smoke fading from a battlefield. By the late 1950s, Nakamura was home again, if home was what you could call a city rebuilt from ashes. Tokyo had changed. Neon signs replaced bomb scars. American cars hummed through streets that once echoed with sirens. She worked as a hospital clerk, now quiet, efficient, unremarkable. No one asked about the war, and she never offered to speak of it. Then one gray winter morning in 1962, a letter arrived from the Red Cross. It was a simple notice: Prisoner Record Update, Camp C, Okinawa. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a copied file index, stamped faintly in English. One name leaped off the page: Sergeant Thomas Walker. Her breath caught. For a moment the years peeled away. She was back in that tent, the heat, the dust, the stare that had rewritten her life in silence. She read the line again and again, as if repetition could steady her pulse. The file said he'd been transferred home in 1946. No further record. Possibly deceased. Possibly alive. That uncertainty burned hotter than truth ever could. Nakamura spent the evening walking through Shinjuku's crowded streets, the city glowing like an open wound healed over with light. She wondered if he'd gone back to teaching, if he'd married, if he still carried the guilt that had haunted her every night since. Later, in her small apartment, she took out the old scrap of paper from the camp, the one with the unfinished sentence. She added a few more words beneath it in unsteady handwriting. You were human, I was too, that was enough. Out of 4,000 prisoners from Okinawa, fewer than 200 women ever had their files indexed after repatriation. Most disappeared into anonymity. Her name shouldn't have resurfaced. Yet here it was, stitched by fate to his, like two forgotten threads finding each other decades too late. She folded the document carefully, slid it into an envelope, addressed it, but never sent it. It stayed in a drawer until the end of her life, unopened, unmailed, but somehow necessary. Outside, snow began to fall soft, silent, endless. She watched it drift past the window and whispered, Walker, like a prayer no one would ever hear. Tokyo, 1988. A single camera hummed softly inside an NHK recording studio. Across from the lens sat Nakamura, older now, hair streaked with silver, posture straight despite the years. Her hands rested quietly in her lap. She had agreed to the interview only after weeks of hesitation. The producers wanted oral histories from survivors of the Pacific War, but they had no idea the story she carried. The interviewer adjusted his notes. You were a prisoner of war, correct? She nodded once. Yes. And what do you remember most about that time? She paused. For a moment the air thickened with memory. Then she said softly, his eyes. The room went still. She described it carefully, almost clinically at first. The humid tent, the lantern light, the sentence that split her life in half. Look at me and don't lie. Her voice trembled only once, on the word look. She didn't mention the kiss. She didn't have to. The silence around it said enough. The interviewer leaned forward. Did you ever see him again? Nakamura shook her head. No, but sometimes I think he never left. The translator hesitated, unsure whether to carry that sentence across languages. He did. Outside the studio, Tokyo's skyline glowed, neon towers humming where air raid sirens had once screamed. The city had long moved on, but in that small, soundproof room, time folded in on itself. Two ghosts, one American, one Japanese, met again through memory. Her final words weren't in response to a question. They came unprompted, almost as if spoken to the lens itself. War ends, she said quietly, but eyes remember. The tape kept rolling for several seconds after she finished. No one spoke, just the faint buzz of the lights and the sound of her breathing, steady, fragile, real. Later, when the documentary aired, viewers called that moment the silence that said everything. Some turned off their TV mid-broadcast, unable to shake the image of an old woman staring straight through the screen into them, because even decades later, that stare, tired, human, unflinching, still carried the weight of a history no report had dared to write. And in the flicker of that black-hand, white footage, the war that ended long ago felt alive for one last heartbeat.